Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. We're very excited to have Dr. Mary Brownell from the University of Florida with us today. I have a few notes about Mary. She's the director of the CEDAR Center, which stands for the Collaboration for Effective Educator Development and Accountability Reform Center, a $25 million collaborative operation funded through the Office of Special Ed Programs, and is doing really exciting professional development and technical assistance work in various states around the country. Mary has also received funding over the years from IES and from OSEP, millions of dollars. She was the Teacher Education Division's Ted Pearson Award winner, which is a Lifetime Achievement Award for Research and Scholarship Excellence in Teacher Ed. It's the highest award given by that group. She was 5 years as the Irving and Rose Fine Endowed Professor at the University of Florida. She's won multiple doctoral mentoring awards for her work at UF, and I have the unofficial notes. Mary is also a former jazzercise instructor.
I can't believe you found that.
And is an expert moonwalker. Who knew? Maybe not in those shoes. Join me in welcoming Mary to Grounds, and we're very excited for this talk. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Yeah, he makes fun of me for that. I'm going to give you some paper because at some point I'm going to ask you to write down your ideas, and this is the paper that Michael ran off from me, so I didn't want to waste it. It's not his paper, it's my notes. So we're able to get to appear here. Well, you might be wondering why I would choose this title. The first center we had funded in, I think it was 2001. And that's when the Office of Special Ed Programs had research authority. And our charge as a center, and it was Paul Sindelar and myself and Mike Rosenberg and a collection of other people, but our charge was to really look at preparation effectiveness. And we started out by looking at the dependent measure, because we didn't know how to assess educator preparation effectiveness without having some way of measuring it. And so we started working with a collection of people that you'll see in a second. But I wanted to tell you about that work and then what it took us to. There were all kinds of things that I'd love to talk to you about. One is a literature synthesis we just did, but I had to make some decisions about what would be the focus of this talk. But while we were working on teacher quality, Stan Dino, and if you don't know him, Stan is really the person who started down the path of developing curriculum-based measurement and a great person in special education. He listened to some of our conversations. He was a consultant for us, and he said, you know, Mary, this reminds me, your discussions about teacher quality remind me of Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance. And he said, and that guy drove himself crazy trying to find quality. So I entitled the presentation that. The only problem was I had to go back out and read the book again. And I'm going to try to weave it in because it actually is a very fitting book for the path we went down. These are all the collaborators. I had a hard time with the spacing, so worked with lots of different people across the country. Good colleagues. Some of the goals that I really want to highlight today, you know, I always feel funny talking about my own research for this reason. It's not so much what you learn about a study or a few studies or even a small collection of studies. It's really how you deal with the challenges and what you learn along the way, or what you learn from a huge body of literature that I think is more informative. So I want to talk about some of the challenges that we encountered. If you have some novel ideas for thinking about how to deal with some of these challenges, I would love to hear them because they persist. And then I want to talk to you about some of the insights we've gained from using mixed methods, about special ed teaching quality, and what does quality professional development, at least from the amount of work that we've done, look like for those teachers. So I'm going to ask you to think about how you might characterize effective reading instruction for students with reading disabilities, but we're going to, as you're thinking about that, I want you to watch about 2 to 3 minutes of a teacher, because I'm going to ask you to describe her instruction, and then I'm going to ask you to rate it on a scale of 1 to 4, with 1 being poor and 4 being strong. And it'll be good if not everybody agrees, because it'll help me out with the presentation. If you all agree, that's okay, but we'll just see here. Oh, it's kind of dark.
Alright, let's go ahead and trace. Melissa, you ready? I'll start you. Okay, use your tracing pad. Ready? U-N-G says own. You need to make sure we hear that in. Own. Okay? A little bit louder, guys. A-N-G says ache. I-N-G says ink. Okay, Grant, I don't hear you. U-N-K says unk. Good job. O-N-G says unk. I-N-K says ink. I heard E. It's not. When we hear ink, what letter do we always use? I. It's because E is so busy being on the end of words that he can't be with the words. Can we go next one? Good. Good. Here we go. U says A says yeah, remember your signals? O says I says good. Alright, your turn. You ready to write? First sound is catch it? No, so you guys catching it, Grant. Now write it. Alright, just be careful. Okay, good. Okay, ready? Okay, that says I need to see Okay, use your tongue. That says I need
In November, observed as a holiday.
Okay, Grant, same with you. We need U-N-G. Okay, we do grade. Okay, next sound is aim. Catch it? Aim. Write it. Next sound is ing. Catch it? Okay, write it. Next sound is unk. Catch it?
So I'm just going to skip this stuff. I'll move to the next slide. So tell me, as you were watching this, how would you describe Paige's instruction?
Orton Gillingham.
You're right, she was trained in Orton Gillingham. But what descriptors would you use if you were writing an observation tool? What descriptors would you use?
Explicit.
Explicit?
Fast-paced.
Fast-paced?
Feedback.
Feedback? Yeah, you noticed she was using corrective feedback.
Cues and scaffolds.
She was using cues and scaffolds for the students. Remember, these are third graders, and so now you have a sense of how far behind they are, because those are not third grade skills. So these students are easily more than a year off level in their reading. Other descriptors?
I might actually go a little different direction. I noticed that the children weren't always responding with the same amount of certainty each time, but that didn't always elicit any kind of a scaffolding response from the teacher. It seemed to be getting through the cards was more important than finding out why a student wasn't saying the word or the sound.
So what would you, just let me ask, what would you have done differently?
Well, I guess what I would, and I guess it depends on the purpose of the task, but all that I noticed was that there was a repetition, and maybe the pace didn't change even when students' responses seemed to change.
Right.
So I'm not going to offer any sort of alternative, just an observation.
I will. So it is explicit instruction, but when I think about explicit instruction in very simple terms, I think of I do it, we do it, you do it. And I wouldn't say that I saw a real good model of that with this video clip. That I didn't see her necessarily modeling the skills, practicing it together, and then the most important part that I think we miss a lot of times is giving the kids an opportunity to practice it again.
So if you were, now you only got to see 30 minutes, so I mean for 2 minutes of a 30-minute tape, but we'll go further. So if you were to rate her, would anyone rate her as a 1? A 2? A 3? How about a 4? I'm going to tell you this is interesting because this is the challenge that you get into. You go deep like you were, but as a team, we kept coming back to her because she was one of the stronger teachers that we had videotape of. And I think what we get into here is trying to define explicit instruction so that it matters each time, because what she was doing was reviewing, which if you know Orton Gillingham, the first thing you do is you usually go through the cards and then you go into other lessons. So we got into this problem of what does explicit mean? And do all the behaviors have to be present for it to be explicit? I'm actually relaying to you the hour-long days on days end conversations that we had over trying to define this instruction. If you watched it for 30 minutes, you would definitely say it was intense because she moves through about 5 activities. In fact, she moves from this to having the students write, as you saw. Then she moves to having each of the students read the words. And then she moves into having them write sentences. This is pretty traditional. I'm not surprised you recognized it as Orton Gillingham. And so the challenge then became, when you're reviewing a lot, do you really expect to see a teacher model? But one of the dilemmas that her instruction brought up for us is, were the kids just sort of rotely doing this, or were they really thinking while they were having to write each sound? So we had an item that ended up defining effective word study instruction that was called Consciously Help Students, teaches in a way that helps students consciously apply the patterns and the sounds, because that was one of our biggest criticisms of Paige. But I say that all to show you just how hard this task is. You know, so here we have the teacher that the group agrees, after watching lots and lots of videotapes, is still stronger than most of the other teachers. And so what do we do about that? Like, how do we develop the scale? How do we define the behaviors? And it seems like the more you try to define, the harder it gets. You start to lose something. And you're going to see that as I talk about the first study that we did. Does this change your perspective of Paige once you know this about her? Or does your perspective stay the same? And I found it was interesting that this is the leader of the intervention in the school. She's directing what general ed does, but I think it brings up some really interesting problems that you confront in special ed. So we're going out and and we're trying to capture effective reading instruction. But what we end up finding is we find a teacher who just watching her teach doesn't tell you all about her quality. Because she's leading the intervention team. I've never walked into a school, I didn't walk into any schools where the special ed teacher was in charge of the team and in charge of what the general ed teacher, they worked on it collaboratively, but she was the leader, and the principal had put her in that position because of her knowledge. But it brings up problems. She had the paraprofessional delivering a pretty scripted fluency intervention, which was probably okay. If you've seen Great Leaps, a paraprofessional can probably execute Great Leaps. It's a fluency building package. She was delivering the Orton-Gillingham instruction, and she was working with a general ed teacher who was working on vocabulary and comprehension as part of Tier 3 intervention. So what problems does this bring up as measurement? And she might not be doing what the next special education teacher is doing, but we're all focused on reading instruction.
It's not just her. It's not just what she's doing. It's part of a system that makes a difference.
Which
That's how
is
you read her.
what special ed is supposed to be anyhow. It's delivered by a team. So the first dilemma that we encounter is, how do we think about individual teachers when that's not the point? The point is the team. And then how do we start, and we confronted this in measuring teacher quality, how do we measure reading instruction when reading instruction is about word learning and word learning with vocabulary in it, and it's about fluency building, and it's about working on comprehension when you walk into a classroom and the teacher's responsibility is to deliver one part of reading instruction. And this is just the Tier 3 intervention. The students have spent a whole hour in general education working on reading, because this is a multi-tiered system of support delivery system. So you begin to see the kind of issues that we confront in trying to define exactly what this is that we're trying to unpack. So I talked some about the challenges. I'm always jumping ahead of myself. And so we're back to the art of motorcycle maintenance, Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance. So we're trying to approach this task from kind of a classical view. You know, we can define the phenomena, we can unpack it, and we can name it. And we had terrible problems when we would try to define explicit instruction or applies word learning in ways that kids have to consciously work with the patterns. Or things like, I'm trying to remember some of the items on the instrument, engages students in ways that the students are actively processing the information. So no wonder our attempts sometimes felt like we were rearranging a lot of furniture, intellectual furniture. And when we worked on this, we had this sort of split in the group of us that was working on this. First of all, we had some people who were very steeped in behavioral observation. And so they wanted to get down and define every little behavior, and you checked it off, and you either had it or you didn't. But then there were others in the group, and Russell Gersten was one of the strongest voices, and we had adapted his instrumentation, which was the ELL observation tool that he had, that it worked for him, argued against that. He said, once you try to get down into the fine-grained behaviors, you sort of lose something about the quality of what you're seeing. And so we tried to marry sort of this, how do you capture the general impression of explicitness, which we could all agree to, interestingly. It's just that when we got down to the details, skills. We really struggled. So the first study we started with, and Paige I just used as an illustration, she actually came from our second study. We began with the idea that teaching reading, teaching special education was not a content-free event. And it's important because the highly qualified regulation had just come out. And there was a lot of argument in the field about, are there generic pedagogies that special ed comprises special ed? Special ed's about effective interventions, as if the content was unimportant. But we didn't believe that. We believed that teachers go out and they teach in different settings and they have different curriculum, and so you can't count on what they're going to teach. So we took the stance that teaching was about delivering the content effectively, and that teachers had to know something about the content to enact it. So how did we approach this task? We had 2 separate studies. First, we had beginning special education teachers, and then we added in 60 more teachers who had experience, and so I'm going to talk about that. The special ed teachers, this is really a problem, so we're trying to figure out what our dependent measure is going to be. But special ed teachers teach math to students, they teach reading, so this is the dependent measure, remember, for preparation. They teach reading, sometimes they teach writing, sometimes they provide transition services, and we can't create a measure that embraces all of that complexity. So we decided most elementary special ed teachers are deployed, if they're teaching high incidence students, to teach reading for a good portion of their job. And we then put another set of parameters around it, which they had to be providing 30 to 90 minutes of reading instruction a day. That was another problem that we confronted as we went out, that some teachers were providing all of the reading instruction for 90 minutes, and other teachers were providing intervention instruction for 30 minutes. And you can be in a district and have this enacted differently in every school that you're going into. And then some teachers were pulling students out, and other teachers were pushing students in. And so then we defined beginning teachers as the first 3 years of instruction. These are some of the assessments we use. This is the next problem that you encounter when you're looking at effective beginning and experienced teacher instruction in special ed. We were really concerned about the state assessments being used as the outcome measure. We were uncertain as to whether those would matter for these students. Were they sensitive enough? And we had all kinds of reasons to think that that would be the case. So then we're off into individually administering assessments for the students. And so we chose oral reading fluency and the Woodcock reading mastery test, and we really stumbled when it came to reading comprehension. We couldn't administer the Gates-McGinnity, which other researchers on our team had administered, because we couldn't figure out how to get around the fact that the teachers were teaching at different grade levels, and there was really no way to just stay with one grade level because it presented enormous sampling problems. I mean, we had to work across 3 states to have 90 teachers in the sample. So we took, as I said, Russell Gerston's tool, and we adapted it for what we were seeing there. And then we worked with Jeffrey Phelps and used his knowledge instrument because it became too overwhelming to think about creating additional instrumentation there. And I'm not getting into a lot of the details of the study because I want to take you into what we did for professional development. So this is an item on the observation tool. And one thing that I don't like about what we did, even though this paper, we were delighted it made it into exceptional children, we had generic practices and then we measured reading practices. Because you'll remember I said, we really believed that teachers, expert teachers, knew a lot about the content, knew how to enact it for the students. They had the pedagogical practices, and then they knew a lot about the students and how to respond to them. And so this is an item that was on what we call the instructional practice scale. In retrospect, and now knowing a lot more about Joanne Carlisle and Jeffrey Phelps and Ben Kelsey's work, I would have had us rate these by types of instruction that was going on. So there would have been a decoding or word study unit, and then a fluency unit, and then as if they were separate lessons. And because these change depending on the instruction. So you don't see as much modeling. In decoding instruction, it's very repetitive, so you don't see as much modeling up front. You see teachers reviewing a lot of what they had done before. This was an item where we looked at comprehension. This was one of the items on the scale. So what did we end up learning from this study? And I'm going to talk about what we learned quantitatively and give you a flavor of what we learned qualitatively, because I think sort of the more classical approach and then the more qualitative or subjective approach really provides a richer picture of the teachers, and it helped to drive our next steps. For decoding, content knowledge was related to overall instructional practice. It was not for the beginning teachers, but I actually think it was a sample size issue, because the percentage of variance accounted for was like 1 percentage point less. But when we had the experienced teachers in there, then we had enough power at 92 or 94 teachers. And content knowledge for teaching comprehension was not a significant predictor of practice. Now, we think there's a good reason for that. If you know the assessment that Jeffrey and his colleagues have developed, comprehension knowledge is assessed with the sorts of problems that really, that students who are performing off level probably would never confront. So the text that teachers were working with on the assessment was much harder than the text that a lot of the students that we were working with would have been able to manage. And so we think that's the reason teaching comprehension was not a significant predictor of practice. Special ed teachers who were beginning teachers scored 1/3 of a standard deviation below Jeffrey's sample that had teachers with 15 years of experience. So we were kind of surprised to see that beginning special ed teachers actually had, at least on this assessment, a fair amount of knowledge. The experienced teachers, though, were above the mean of the general ed teachers. And the highly experienced teachers, which were 10 years and older, and they had 10 years of experience or more, they were half a standard deviation above the beginning special ed teachers. So obviously the curriculum and things that they were working with over time and the professional development they had access to was improving their knowledge over time. And you should feel free to ask me questions as we go. So what did we learn about teacher practice? We used hierarchical linear modeling as the analysis. And we found something interesting, and I find it interesting because of what you told me this morning, Peter. Their general practices seem to be the most predictive, but also, though, when you got down to decoding instruction and comprehension instruction, those were working just a tiny bit more effectively than the more general practices. So I think what's interesting here, especially in the area of decoding, you have teachers who are more knowledgeable, engage in more effective practice, and teachers who engage in more effective decoding practice secure better word attack skills among their students. But watch what happens. So when we were working on the data, I feel like we went back and forth between running analyses different ways, talking about what we were seeing, and trying to figure out what was the best way to approach the analysis of this data. So watch what happens when we try to define, we called it instructional intensity. Because I noticed when the statistician was showing me a correlation matrix that the relationship between the special ed teacher and the student began to disappear when the instruction was provided for less time. And what was interesting to me is 60 minutes was sort of the point at which you could either connect the teacher to the students or you started to have really fragile correlations between the teacher and the student. So when we enter time as a moderator, the connection between the special ed teacher and the students increases by 20% of the variance accounted for. And so that, right, that piece of information tells you the big dilemma of assessing these teachers, because I could have had a very effective teacher, and if all I used was her student achievement data, and she was only teaching 20 minutes a day, I may not understand anything about her teacher effectiveness. It also raised some really concerning issues for me about how is intensive service being provided to these students if they're not getting this kind of instruction on a daily basis. What does that mean for their performance and their growth in schools?
There is a time, the time's the
Total amount of time they provided reading instruction. And you'll remember we had everything from people providing 30 minutes a day to one school where it was a success for all school, and it's a school we end up studying more qualitatively because it was so interesting, where the principal said, you know, we have to deploy our resources differently here. We have students, and this was a high poverty school. The 3rd and 4th grade students we were watching there were probably achieving at about a 1st grade level. They were very emergent readers. And what's really concerning in all of this, when you think about the students, is not only are there, you know, word attack skills, which you watched week, but I remember this clearly. A teacher was decoding the word dim, and so she looked at the kids and she said, well, what does that mean? And these are 4th grade students. And the students really had no clue about what that vocabulary word meant. So we're not talking about students who just have word study problems. We're talking about students that have pretty comprehensive issues in special education. And the higher poverty the school was, it seemed the worse the issues were. And also overall, what we concluded is the instruction was often worse in those schools. But in this instance, the instruction was great, at least from our measures and compared to the other teachers. And the principal had decided these students needed intensive instruction. They weren't moving forward unless they got it. So she had 2 special ed teachers that were very well prepared. One had a background in reading, teaching a group of only 13 students. And they were shifting students around and working with them in very homogeneous groups. So we did a number of different kinds of qualitative studies, and one of them a couple of them haven't been written them up for publication yet, which is unfortunate because the one on motivation is really insightful. And I'm going to read to you about some of the teachers here. One of the studies looked at beginning teachers, and we did 2 different things. We actually had 2 different studies. We looked at very accomplished, moderately accomplished, and not so accomplished teachers. And that was another struggle that we had, was how to talk about the not so accomplished people in pretty respectful ways. And we looked at them in 2 different ways. One, we looked at what were the practices that they used to engage students, because we felt like first of all, this was the only research that had been done since the 80s, which was more processed product research. So we felt that it was dangerous to not have richer descriptions of the teachers that we could understand to sort of check against our understandings of the behaviors that we had defined. And so we looked at their how they engaged students, the points at which they were most engaging, because we found that some teachers were very engaging and others not so much so. And then the other thing that we did is that we looked at what they had to say about what they believed about teaching special education, and also how they saw their preparation and how they saw their environment as supporting them in teaching. And then a couple of the other studies were the portraits of the most accomplished teachers, and then one of my doctoral students did a really beautiful dissertation on motivation, and she interviewed the kids and found out what these students thought of these teachers, and we picked highly motivating teachers that were highly motivating to the students, that really engaged them. And then she talked to the teachers about what they believed about motivation and engagement, and then how they enacted their instruction. And so I just like to read to you because it gives you a different picture of the teachers. Here's what one of the most accomplished beginners had to say. The most accomplished beginning teachers were defined by 3 attributes: reflective, we called it resourceful, and relentless. And I'm just going to give you an example of reflective. So the most accomplished beginners seem to think carefully and more detail about their students' needs and their learning environment. They focus more on academics as opposed to relationship building, which I think is interesting. And then 2 of the most accomplished teachers spoke of trying to understand the complexities of students' learning disabilities by attempting to see learning through their eyes and by identifying the academic triggers that led to behavior problems in order to develop individual behavior plans. In both cases, observation notes revealed teacher dialogue that was rich with academic praise and scaffolding for students who were struggling. You actually saw a lot more of what Paige was doing, which was, no, that spells unk. I said, ank. Take a look at that again. Or in the case of one teacher, she was talking about the word squawk, and none of the students recognized the word squawk. So she immediately started to backtrack, and she said the word, and she then read it in a sentence, and the students were really having a hard time, and then she kind of squawked out the sentence, and then got the kid. And so there was this constant scaffolding of student learning by them. They were highly responsive teachers. And the least accomplished teachers did not talk in detailed ways about instruction, which I'm finding the more I do these studies, that's one of the #1 things that I can count on, is that the more effective teachers can talk in very detailed ways about the students and their learning, and they can talk in really very detailed ways about how they're going to do something about the students' learning, whereas the less accomplished teachers cannot. Instead, they spoke in generalities, and their attention focused on the personal relationships with students, rather than the quality of the academic instruction, which I thought was interesting. It's not that the accomplished teachers were uncaring individuals. They were very caring, but their relationships with the students was defined more by how am I going to help these students learn the content. So let me talk to you a little bit about engagement and sort of what we saw there. Kayla was one of the most accomplished beginners, and what she seemed to do with the students is her instruction. She taught all the components of effective reading. She was the one who was teaching for 90 minutes, and she did it in this seamless manner. She would move quickly from one part of the lesson to the next, and if she was providing, like the word squawk was one of the words she was trying to teach. She also worked on how squawk sounds and how squawk is spelled. So she could move back and forth between strategies pretty easily. And she also flexibly used strategies in curriculum during instruction and would integrate multiple evidence-based practices when teaching a skill or a strategy. And that's important because one of the conversations that we had around all of this was in special ed, a lot of the researchers, when we first started approaching this in our group, said, well, we know what the evidence-based practices are, why don't we just look at how they're implemented? But you can see the problem that Kayla would present if you had that perspective on effective instruction. And we all agreed that she was one of the most accomplished teachers. So here's a teacher who's taking the evidence base and she's weaving it together and she's making decisions based on individual students. Her instruction would be characterized by the big ideas of explicit, engaging, highly responsive. But when you got down, if you had like your intervention checklist, Kayla might not look so high if you measured it that way. So let me talk about one of the more motivating teachers, because this is one of the more senior teachers. As I said, we interviewed the students and we picked the teachers on two characteristics. One, they really had to engage the students, and the other was that they had to, the students had to see the teachers as really motivating. And this teacher kind of took us by surprise. This teacher was working in a shelter that the school had set up for homeless students. And she was providing, they were providing all the instruction in the school. And this teacher had lots of students with learning problems and lots of students with all kinds of behavior problems. And yet you rarely saw any explosion of behavior in this classroom. And so when we talked to this teacher, who I'm going to call LW, she employed, just like the first teacher, all types of instructional practices that motivate and engage students to read. She seamlessly integrates those practices, which is kind of a defining feature of expertise. So we're seeing that in these teachers again. But the problem is how do you capture that in a quantitative way, which we ultimately really want to do. And she integrates it into her reading instruction, and she delivers it in a highly individualized, coherent, and systematic manner. I mean, this teacher knows what every kid is doing at every single time in the classroom. And plus, she really gets the kids. So let me just give you an example. One kid came in one day and he was really ready to explode. And so she said to the student, you sit over there, and why don't you go get a game or something or a book to read? And when I can get a minute, I'll come over and see you. So she avoided the whole power struggle that she could have had. She made the student comply with what she wanted the student to do. And before you knew it, she walked over later and started interacting with the student. And probably within 15 to 20 minutes, the student was engaged in the academic lesson with little fuss or a problem. And this is a student who would have probably been qualified as emotionally and behaviorally disturbed. So the other thing about these teachers is students really look excited. They were excited to be introduced to new stories that she brought into the classroom. But she also used some pretty systematic skill instruction. So what you see in these rooms is this going back and forth between highly skill-based instruction. She taught reading mastery, which if you know that is a highly scripted curriculum. But then there were also novels and discussions about novels and peer tutoring. And what was remarkable to me is there were 15 kids in there. And she was orchestrating all of this as if it was easy, you know, and there was nothing easy about this instruction. And I bring this up because the book, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, is really all about this. If you just see the behaviors instructional practice, or you just see comprehension instruction, what you really don't get the sense of when you read the more qualitative studies is what that meant in these different contexts and how it changed depending upon the students or their grade level or what they were doing. So for us, understanding teacher quality was really not just defining the behaviors, but the relationship of things that we were able to establish as we studied the teachers qualitatively. And the other thing that I think is interesting about it is when I give these papers to teachers, guess which ones they resonate to most? The qualitative papers, because they tell them something about teaching. So I bring this to you as a way of showing how mixed methods can really help you unpack sort of what it is that you're seeing quantitatively, like what is explicit instruction? What does it look like in these different conditions? What does it mean to be engaged? And when does it not, when is a student not engaged? Are there any questions? You guys are so quiet.
So I guess this might be an appropriate time to raise a question, and I just have to acknowledge there's a few folks here who are in the course with me this fall. We've spent time just this week on mixed methods, so I want you to know I did not pay Mary to make the last value. We did treat her to dinner, but so I'm wondering if you might just take a minute at this point, and if you'd like to come back to this a little bit later, and you're making a case for sort of the richness, the qualitative data complementing quantitative work. Could you just identify a few of the challenges in working across both types of methodologies and in particular sort of carrying out that work in addition to working with ours?
Well, the most obvious one is the challenge of the time it takes to do this. You don't pound this kind of work out easily. But even the quantitative was so challenging. I mean, I think for 1 or 2 years we worked just on the observation tool, and we would go out and watch the teachers, and then we would change the observation tool depending on what we were seeing, because one thing that happened, and I kind of smiled when you told me how you saw the teacher done, is faculty tend to have very pure views of what effective instruction is, and we were leveling them at the teachers, and I said, but wait a minute, somebody has to be, there has to be variance here. We can't, there is variance here. And so obviously the time is, for us was the biggest challenge. It was just managing the data. So we wouldn't observe all the teachers as carefully or interview all of them. We had to pick and choose. And we tried to do it by most sort of moderate and least, because we wanted to see the variance effectiveness played out.
So I can follow up just a little bit. So, and you and I know each other, you know a little bit about my work. In my work, I tended to focus more on general education teachers. There seem, and you alluded to some of this, there seems to be some challenges around having a critical number of special ed teachers. Leads of research seem to be in 2 or 3 states, or at least many different schools and districts. Also, there seems to be things about the fact that special ed teachers have a range of responsibilities and training, and even if we're thinking of 2 beginning special ed teachers who are both working in LD with students with learning disabilities, their assignments could vary. It's just not sort of one thing to be an LD teacher.
Right. In our new center that we have that works on preparation systems for teachers, special ed and general ed teachers and leaders, we have talked, we're developing a policy document about the problem this presents to preparing people effectively and the problem it presents to being effective. And what's interesting is we proposed that we use the multi-tiered systems as support as a way of licensing the teachers and began to think about special ed teachers as they're going to come in and they're going to provide the intervention system instruction. But here is where research and policy meet. The minute we proposed that, the state directors that were in the meeting, not always special ed state directors, because we're working with the superintendents of the state, there was a lot of pushback. Because what about shortages? And so I feel like it's a real conundrum for a field that we can't. One thing about special ed is we don't get to define ourselves. And we don't get to define instruction for our students in a lot of ways, because here's what happens. The research is about helping the kid fit into the system as it currently exists. We don't get to come in and say, you know, it'd be really great if language arts instruction looked like this. It would be a whole lot better for our students. We have to come in and, to be quite frank, pick up the problems that the students are bringing. Or in a school, the special ed teacher doesn't get to come in and say, I'm a highly trained interventionist. I have a lot of background in reading, so I really want to provide tier 3 instruction. They might be all of a sudden teaching biology. And so I think it's one of the worst issues for our field is our inability to define our roles as special education teachers and prepare for it. It's an area where I think we should push the most for that. Go ahead, Michael.
This has made me think about something that's, I don't know if it's concerning, but with this work, did you take into account any of the contextual factors within each school? So here's what I'm thinking about some places where I've been, and some of the schools, Paige would have been a rock star teacher because of the contextual environments of that particular school. Another school, that might have been just average instruction, depending on the school climate, the population of students, the leadership, etc. So was any of that taken into account when you're thinking about this idea of teacher quality and different measures?
This is where trying to collect all the, it's partly why we did a lot of the qualitative work, so we could show the different situations, because I didn't read this, you know, in the interest of time, but one of the least accomplished teachers had been trained in transition secondary, and she was in upper elementary teaching reading, and she had 25 students in the classroom. And so she wasn't a great teacher when she worked on small group instruction, not in reading. She might have been great in putting kids into community settings and working with them. She was not great as an elementary reading teacher. But who could be great in a context where you have kids that are performing a year and 2 years behind, and you have 25 of them, and they're ranging from 3rd to 5th grade, you know, which sometimes the grade levels are irrelevant, because you can have a 5th grader who has the reading achievement of a 1st grader, and a 3rd grader who's maybe, you know, just a year behind, and they're actually further ahead in their reading. But my point is there was just enormous diversity. We did do some surveys. In fact, school climate did end up predicting comprehension gains. But I feel like it became overwhelming to create the observation tool, to collect the data, to do some of the qualitative work, to interview the teachers. And this is where there's all these trade-offs in these sorts of studies. What's really unfortunate to me is there's so many big data sets collected on general ed teachers, and special ed teachers are not sampled sufficiently to understand them. Like, we can't go to the MET study and use the Measuring Effective Teaching study and use their special ed sample of teachers to understand it. So, you know, the problem though is we create all these policies and then, I'd like to talk for a little bit about what we did in the professional development study. I loved working on the teacher quality study. Sometimes I thought it was the bane of my existence to work so hard on quality. But this study I really enjoyed, and this is one we just wrapped up. It occurred over 4 years, and we did it as a result of what we were watching. And so we decided, okay, our next step is to intervene. And most of the teachers, we thought about comprehension instruction because Jeanette was an important part of our group. But the truth of the matter is most of the teachers were providing decoding and fluency instruction and intervention. So we didn't work on comprehension just because we were concerned the context wouldn't support it. So you're not only limited by studying the phenomena because of the context, you're limited as to what you can study and put forth because of the context. So we stayed on our path because the teachers that we were watching and the measures that is at least of decoding knowledge, knowledgeable teachers matter. And to say otherwise would defy a whole literature based on expertise. You know, there's one thing we know about professional expertise is that professional experts have deep knowledge and it's well integrated and they can execute it easily. So we stayed with that. We felt that teachers needed to have active opportunities to learn. They had to see good instruction modeled for them. They had to receive feedback. They had to talk with each other about how they would implement their instruction. And then we felt strongly that if the district goals or the school goals were working against what we were asking the teachers to do, that we would be bumping up against a wall. And as we did this work, we found that Laura Desimone's work kind of captured well what we thought was important about effective professional development. And we adapted it because Laura does not talk as much about ongoing analysis of student data. And she does not talk about something that sat inside of active learning opportunities, but we did a lot of individualization for teachers. I don't know how many of you watch teachers, but if you watch them a lot, there is enormous variability in the instruction of teachers. And so we developed this intervention that I'm going to talk about. Let's have a Marco Rubio moment. He's our senator. We developed this intervention about professional development model, and we based it on Nora's work. And we wanted to look at how this very comprehensive package that had a professional development institute where we provided content and pedagogical knowledge, and had after-school meetings where teachers met as cohorts, and then a coaching and intervention that actually, the whole intervention changed over time. This was an IES development study, and what relationship it had to students' achievement in decoding and fluency. We wanted to assess comprehension, but remember, we're assessing these students individually, and we're already pulling them 30 minutes at least for assessment. So again, you know, we're constrained by what schools will let us do and what we thought was really fair to the students, how long we could hold these young kids in such in a testing situation like that. So we looked at third, fourth, fifth grade again, bless you, and there were a lot of challenges that we faced, and the first one was teachers' knowledge. This was one of your colleagues here, Irene Gansky, I think. Isn't that, yeah? She had a book on orthography and phonology that was easily this big. But we have teachers who don't have all that knowledge. And so how do you reasonably support teachers in acquiring that knowledge when you think it's important to effective word study instruction? And then how do you balance all of that with teachers want to know what they can do to improve student achievement. So how do you balance that with all the pedagogical kind of knowledge that they need to have? So, you know, we're back to this quality thing again. What's quality going to look like? And then we have the measurement problem again. You know, here's, and I thought maybe we'd get rid of it as we move to professional development. But Standino was right. I was, you know, destined to have to study and define quality forever. And we're back at it in the Cedar Center, believe it or not. I can talk about more about that. And we didn't have valid and reliable teacher measures. And you might say, but you had your last instrument. But here's the problem it posed for us. That instrument covered reading generally. So what we started to become worried about was, is that going to be sensitive to the smaller gains that teachers might make as a result of instruction And 3 items on a comprehension scale might, or 3 items on a word study scale might mask, the grain size for the measurement might be too big. Plus we needed the measurement to be of a sufficient grain size to give the teacher's feedback. Okay, so we're back into this problem again. And then the knowledge instrumentation, we used Jeffrey's knowledge instrumentation again, because to be quite frank with you, as we worked with Jeffrey on it, he advised us to focus on the observation because it was just too hard. So we did the best that we could, and we used his decoding instrument. So, but even when you focus on word study and fluency, you have kids who are decoding first grade words and students that we're teaching multisyllabic decoding to. So we're back to this problem about how do you define the behaviors so that it'll cut across both types of instruction. An implementation checklist is not going to work here. We have to be able to work across very different types of instruction. And teachers' time available for instruction varies again, and we can't control that. You know, we just have to live with what's out there. And then there's the overwhelming grader issues. So this is how we conceptualized it, and I'm going to talk for a little bit about this, and I might skip over some of the studies, but I will talk about both a few of the qualitative and then the quantitative studies. We had a professional development institute that we ran for 2 days, and we had 5 after-school meetings, and we would focus them on each of the content areas. So word study with phonological awareness, basic decoding, advanced decoding, multisyllabic decoding, fluency. One of the bigger problems that the teachers ran into was with multisyllabic decoding, which was getting into morphological awareness, because if you examine the elementary curriculum, it doesn't do a very good job of supporting teachers in providing that kind of instruction. And we had an e-community, and then we had 4 videotaped observations, including researcher feedback. And I'm going to skip through the first qualitative study and the first iteration, because I'm afraid we could run out of time here. This is the content that was included. We had a scope and sequence of knowledge instruction for decoding, strategies for blending and segmenting. We had a lot of strategies for decoding multisyllabic words. In fact, I think it's McKenna who is here, right?
Yes.
We borrowed from that work, and we had, and you'll see the closed syllables, open syllables, that's something that you'll see McKenna write about, and syllable division rules, because we knew these students had to have things to hang on to learn how to do this work and read more complex words. And then we had strategies for building fluency at the rhyme level and the word level, and then the connected text level. And we talked a lot about, we relied on Melanie Kuhn and Rosinski's fluency work, so it wasn't just about accuracy and rate. We were trying to get teachers to focus on, well, how would you know if a kid was reading and making sense while they were reading? And then we taught the teachers, and this became one of the most interesting tools. We taught them to use the core phonics assessment. And I would have never in my wildest dreams believed that this little 10-minute survey of skill would have such a big impact on the teachers. But here's what happened. This is a reading first day, Florida, where we did a lot of the qualitative studies. So we were already collecting DIBELS, oral reading fluency data. And they were in California and they were in Colorado. And so the teachers called it dibbling. The teachers had dibbling. But I said to the group, you know, that's like taking a kid's temperature. So I know their oral reading fluency is weak, and I know I need to do something, but I don't know what it is that I really ought to do because I don't really have any diagnostic information. So we used the core phonics, and the teachers, because oftentimes they weren't giving the assessments themselves, and they were just, this stuff was being done to them. When when they gave the core phonics, it's like we opened up the door for them to be teachers again. And they said, now I know how to focus my students' instruction. I thought my students, as I was marching through reading mastery, were getting this, but they weren't. And it became this enormous aha experience for them, which troubled me then. Like, how could we support teachers better in collecting and making sense of their own data so they can make smart decisions around it, which has been fundamental to special ed all along. And so let me flip through what we did in year one. As interesting as the 3 teachers were, we did change a little bit in year 2, but we make a pretty profound change for year 3 when we go to field testing the instrument. And I want to tell you why we did that. We ran 2 studies. One was a grounded theory for improving our understanding of the factors that explain teachers' abilities to apply PD strategies. And then I have always been troubled about this whole concept of collaboration. Like, we think collaboration changes what teachers do. Yeah, I get in these collaborative groups with these teachers, and I'm really concerned about the dialogue. I rarely hear teachers pushing each other. What I usually hear is a friendly sharing kind of situation. So we wanted to look at the discourse and see, are people really getting anything out of these collaborative cohort meetings, and what does all this mean? And Melinda Lico, who was a former student, took the lead on that, and then I worked with a student to take the lead on the grounded theory paper. And so we took participants in Florida and Colorado, and we stayed with the cohorts. We analyzed this by cohorts because we thought that cohorts would have to matter depending on who was in them. Now, I'll tell you, this is the most phenomenal phenomenon, if I can use those 2 words together, that I've ever seen. I could almost count on in every cohort group having at least one teacher who was really pretty good, if not bordering on very effective. And then I could count on about 2 to 3 of them being sort of okay. And then 1 or 2 people really needing a lot of help. And it didn't matter, and no matter what study I do, I see the same phenomenon. The bell curve. If you see it, but it's really, really fascinating. So in 2 of the studies, we analyzed the data by cohorts, and we were in a very urban school. And here's this is the other challenge of doing this work in an urban school. They'll hire anybody. And teachers, some of the teachers we worked with were PE teachers who all of a sudden were teaching reading, or psychology majors who took the test and now they were teachers in the state of Florida. And what we should be really concerned about that, because these are people that are going off to teach the kids who really needed LW that I described. They need the best teachers of all, because the instruction for these students, here's what I see as the difference between general ed and special ed. General ed can be broader and less precise because the kids can learn in that context. But as you move down to these students who really struggle to move forward, even inch by inch, we can't afford for anything but the very best and the most precise instruction. And so what they were getting and who was teaching them was really, and how to help people when you have a teacher with 20 years of experience who really knows a good amount, who wants to participate, but still could improve, and you have a teacher who barely knows what a lesson in reading should look like, is really a challenge in doing the work. So these are some of our data sources. We have, our primary data source, open-ended questions, sort of the classic data sources. I'm not going to dwell on this. This was the grounded theory. We went through the typical grounded theory analysis. But what we came to was, and I need to get some notes here. What we came to was this model of their instruction and you'll see we keep revisiting the same kind of themes again. The core theme was teachers' ability to analyze. And what we saw coming in, individual teachers had different levels of knowledge. In fact, in this study, you could achieve a 42 on this, or 41 on Jeffrey's decoding instrument that he created for this study. And the best teacher only scored, I think it was a 26. But the teacher who made the most improvement scored just 1 point lower than her, 25. But the scores were not great in terms of knowledge for teaching. And so what we saw, though, is that teachers' initial knowledge about just how to teach to students with disabilities and how they enacted that knowledge and their disposition. So if they were highly motivated to push themselves as learners, everyone was motivated. Remember, they all volunteered to show up. They came to every cohort meeting. But if they were disposed to really be critical of themselves and push themselves, that mattered too. And then there were these contextual factors that mattered, but they mattered less for the stronger teachers. And what you would see happening that would really derail the weaker teachers is they had no control over what they were supposed to provide for the students. So what ends up happening in a lot of multi-tiered instruction is Tier 3 just becomes reteaching the general ed curriculum to the students. And the weaker teachers really didn't know how to balance that, whereas the stronger teachers actually could negotiate with their peers better to have time for the students and what they were going to do as teachers. And then what teachers resonated with was interesting. This will surprise you, but the teachers who demonstrated more effective instruction actually wanted the coach to talk to them more. They valued the coach coming in and analyzing their instruction and giving them recommendations. And I think what was happening here is that the more effective teachers recognized that the coach had something to offer them that the other teachers didn't have to offer them. And I just saw a paper, I think it was by Penwell, where the more expert coaches actually were the ones that made the difference in what the teachers were learning. And the less accomplished teachers liked being in the group. They liked listening to their colleagues talk about the strategies. They thought they picked up good little, tricks like bingo games and things like that. But it was really the teacher's ability to look at their instruction, talk about what was going on with their instruction, and analyze it that allowed them then to develop what we saw as really integrated knowledge and practice. So for instance, Nikki was the teacher who had the strongest ability to analyze. And she watched a few of our first videos of more effective word study instruction. And none of the other teachers said this. The first thing Nikki says to us is, I want to teach just like that. And I know that I'm not engaging the students, and I know that my instruction is not as deliberate and sharp as it should be. And what you would see in Nikki that you didn't see in the other teachers, we were also using Randy O'Connor's book to support instruction. Nikki would come in and you would see the book laying on her desk, tabbed and highlighted. And it's as if you could, it's as if she was reading the chapter, thinking about what was being learned in the professional development that was aligned, and just coming right in and implementing in a pretty seamless way. And Nikki could get more done in 25 minutes than she had these students, because she was the most disadvantaged in some ways. She only had 25 minutes, not even frequently to deal with the students. But she could get more done in 25 minutes than the other teachers were able to do. And what you saw, though, was this highly integrated knowledge. When you talked to her, you would listen to Nikki talk about, she was using the Great Leaps curriculum, and she said, when I gave the students the core phonics survey and I realized how far behind they were, I realized that Great Leaps wasn't going to work as it was right now. I mean, this is a great example of her really getting in like with a scalpel and analyzing what she was doing. And then she said, so I decided to change my fluency instruction until I could come back to Great Leaps, because she knew Great Leaps was an effective program, and this is exactly what she did. So she created all her own text materials for the students to practice the decoding strategies and then be able to read the strategies in text, which was really interesting. John, were you going to ask?
A lot of work.
A lot of work. A lot of work. Which is the concerning part, because if they don't have a curriculum, then they're off to doing all this intense work. But even Nikki would do things that were concerning, and this example that sticks out in my head was that she was teaching R-controlled sounds. And one of them, she taught E, ER, and AR, and sometimes she would teach too many patterns at once. And her students were in 4th grade, and they really could not read. I mean, they were at the very most emergent levels of reading. And, but she threw in a word like, I think it was tear. And I thought, you don't want to teach R-controlled sounds. It is an R-controlled word, but you don't want to teach R-controlled sounds when students are trying to learn them and all of a sudden throw in a word that's a little bit different and it's not quite working, you know, because you have these kids who are really struggling. And the same would happen with diagraphs. And we would teach people, we would watch people teaching, you know, blends as a diagraph. And so we watched a lot of mistakes in the content. So we were challenged by that. The other thing we were challenged by is that the teachers multisyllabic instruction was really hard. And I said, you know, there weren't many supports in the curriculum to do this work. And I think we were throwing too many strategies out to them, which was a lesson to us. So that when we would watch them implement, and that was all they would do was implement. So they would use a word sort, or they would implement some kind of rule, or they'd show the kids, like, if you say the words and you put your hand under your chin, that's how you tell the difference. But it was as if they were picking and choosing strategies rather than thinking about it as Nikki was. So we thought about this and we thought, okay, so what are we going to do? Because this isn't working well, and these students do need to develop multisyllabic word knowledge and some morphological word knowledge. So I was blessed to have a doctoral student who had taught in a private school for students with learning disabilities in Philadelphia, Alexandria. And she said, you know, I had to work so hard on that. I was trained as an Norton Gillingham teacher, and I didn't have the support, so we created a word study manual. And what we did to support teachers in their knowledge, which I see as a continuing problem that we have, is we talked about, here's the sequence of instruction as it unfolds. Here's what basic decoding looks like. Here's the rules. Here's how you might teach it. And then we put together a sequence for moving through multisyllabic word instruction. And we did the same thing with fluency, because a lot of times they were using the practices we were teaching them for fluency, but they weren't really getting kids to read consciously while they were reading. So we talked a lot about prosody. The other thing we noticed in the discourse analysis is we had teachers that had high discourse knowledge versus low. I didn't go through Nikki, but these were the different teachers. And we always pick teachers at different levels. Before I move to the discourse analysis, let me just talk here for a minute about Catherine, because it really highlights Catherine actually had more knowledge for reading than Nikki, and she was teaching reading mastery. But this is what the problem is when people don't have more integrated knowledge. She would just come in and implement the curriculum, and her students weren't doing well on the core phonics assessment. So, but she would cling to it, and she was a beginning teacher. She was only in her second year. So we found too that that was the other thing that was a problem in the context, is that the curriculum, if it was too prescriptive, then it didn't allow us to integrate strategies into it. So that was a dilemma for us, because here you have this evidence-based practice, and yet you have a curriculum that people can't take what they're learning and then integrate it into it. And so we thought, okay, so what are we going to do about that? So we come to the discourse analysis, and we sort of find the same thing, actually. We categorize these teachers as high-level knowledge, high inquiry, and they pose questions to the group, they describe in detail what they're doing, and the teachers, I think I have a slide here, the teachers present better opportunities for the students to learn. This is how we did the analysis. They present better opportunities for the students to learn. So that some teachers have this really integrated knowledge that they demonstrate. They talk about the assessments, they talk about the practice, Nikki was one of them. They talk about the practice that they enacted, and they ask the group lots of questions about how to improve their instruction. And then we have this one group that demonstrates a lot of implementation. Interestingly, these were sometimes the teachers with the most experience. And they were the ones that saw themselves in the group as helping everybody else. So they would bring lots of ideas to the group and ways that they were implementing, but they never really asked questions about student performance. And they never really talked about, like Nikki did, why they were doing certain things because of students' performance. And then we had teachers who really just didn't have knowledge. Like the teacher who to me in his final interview said, I really liked being part of this group because when I started I didn't even know what a consonant, vowel, consonant word was. And so those teachers liked listening, and that was what we found was really interesting about these teachers. So we come away from this saying, you know, collaboration works and it doesn't work. And it all depends on who shows up, what opportunities they provide for the other teachers. And then the other interesting piece of it is, guess who likes the coach the most? The teacher in the top category. And the teachers who like the sharing the most are the teachers, particularly in the lowest category. And so we thought, okay, what are we going to do with what we're learning here? How are we going to support teachers in analyzing their instruction more? What are we going to do about the innovation? Because this is a goal 2 study and we get to change the innovation based on that. What are we going to do about the innovation? What are we going to do about supporting teachers' knowledge? And how are we going to create better discourse in the group that provides a better opportunity to learn? So this is what we did. Now we have an additional half day where people have to go out and get their assessments and bring the data, and we analyze them in the group. And we talk about a plan of action. So we put in place a plan of action. We have the same content, but we've added a teacher's manual that helps people get through the content. The other thing we decided to do was put lesson planning inside the cohort group. So rather than talk more extensively about the strategies and how they were implementing them, we had them bring their plan of action, what they said they were going to do when they left the last meeting, and how it worked, and what they were going to do differently, and then they had the plan to bring in the strategies. And then we did something that I thought was really interesting. We were very concerned about teachers not being able to analyze their instruction. So we videotaped them and we taught them to self-reflect on their instruction. So we taught them what some key behaviors were like, explicit instruction, what coherent instruction looked like, because sometimes activities didn't match up, and what intensive instruction looked like. And we had definitions for it, and we taught them to watch it. And then what would happen is they would watch themselves, and the coach would watch, and they would come in then and talk together about what they saw. Teachers did over time, and one of the studies that the Colorado group did over time, they did begin to unpack their instruction a little more effectively.
Mary, I'm just going to jump in. We might take a few questions as we go close to 3. Do you have a few more slides?
Oh, yeah, I've been skipping, I shouldn't have put so many together, see, that's what I get. But in the end, we applied hierarchical linear modeling again, and we have a treatment that works well in word attack, but not so well in oral reading fluency. I will say that effect size, though, is an effect size that's been found in some of the intervention studies, and it's been significant. But right now, we only have 42 teachers, 20 in control, 22 in treatment. So we have those problems. And teachers, though, grew in their practices, both the time they spent on evidence-based practice and the quality of that instruction. So we kind of come to the end like this, but we obviously raise a lot more challenges than issues because these teachers probably spend 40 hours over the course of the year in professional development, and this is just word study and fluency.
Wow.
So what does that mean when we think about reading instruction, the whole of reading instruction? So I don't know, I took you through a journey of using subjective reality and objective reality to tell you about our work, but I wonder if you have questions.
I was actually wondering if you could go back to the discourse analysis slide for
Okay.
any design. Not really have a question about it, I just wanted to see it. That one, yeah.
What we would love to do, if we were going back to this study, is to look at how ideas that were generated in the group then became enacted in instruction. But see, here's the other problem that you confront. You can't be out there observing these teachers all the time. Observing them 6 times over the course of the year was a burden. 42 teachers, 3 states again.
So I find it very interesting that you have it was on one of your last slides where you talk about the 3 different types of teachers and who is really going towards the coach and who's gravitating towards the coach, the stronger teachers.
Yeah.
So how are we going to help those that are, or what are your thoughts on, trying to support the teachers that are not as skilled and not as open to having a coach in the room, or maybe a coach isn't the right intervention?
That changed a little bit when we went to the video self-reflections and the conversation with the coach. In fact, I couldn't show you everything that we've learned. I had to pick and choose. But a study that we didn't publish, when we interviewed the teachers in this particular study, the field test, they all thought the coach was the most effective part of the instruction. Now, this is a little disappointing. Planning was the least effective. They thought that was the least effective, which was a great concern to us because, we felt like the teachers who spent a lot of time planning actually were the ones who engaged in stronger instruction.
But picking up on Shanna's question, the talk was very helpful for me for thinking about how someone with a higher level of knowledge, more expertise as a teacher, might engage with a certain form of PE much differently than someone who less experience, less knowledge. They may just be less in a position to benefit from critical feedback.
I think it's worth pursuing more PD that looks at teaching teachers how to analyze their own and each other's instruction, because then you're building capacity. And I was talking to the dean this morning, and he talked about how we're doing that with his work. Michael.
This made me think of some of Carol Dweck's work on mindset. It looks like you identified that mindset as being a key feature of teachers, and then you took it one step further and you were trying to teach them how to have that appropriate mindset with the reflection of videos. And so I think that's maybe more of the solution, is how do we facilitate the right mindset for teachers to be reflective and self-critical So, because they're all going to come in and be novices at some point.
Right.
So how do we facilitate that growth over time with the right attitude? I mean, that's really what it is. It's an attitude towards learning and reflection, et cetera.
You know, one of my former students right now is doing a study with a colleague at Purdue, and she's using lesson study. And I think lesson study and the way they're enacting it has potential for that. And they've taken them through this process very carefully, which is they look at the pedagogical strategy that the Iris Connect provides a lot of those. And they go to Iris and they get the strategy, and then they talk together about planning to implement it as a lesson. And then they analyze their lesson, and they're teaching them how to analyze their instruction. And what's ended up happening is that the students are now naturally engaging in this behavior. And so next year, they're going to implement it now in the reading methods class. So, and it's because the students have liked it so much, the faculty are embracing the strategy. So I think we need some strategies for really getting people to analyze the instruction. But we also need strategies to support their content knowledge. I mean, it's really problematic.
A question about the nature of the coaching with the video. Some of us here are working with a very specific formula involving coaching from video. The kinds of prompts that we give students to use to reflect upon. So I wondered if you'd tell us a bit about the kinds of prompts, the kinds of coaching from the video that was used.
Okay. Well, we did, that's a really good question. What we did is, the observation tool as it was might have been a little overwhelming for the teachers. So we picked some key behaviors, and one was explicitness, and another one was providing coherent practice with feedback. And we defined it, and we helped the teachers identify it in a video. And we didn't always have great videos. I have to tell you, that's another problem. Is, we're going to show people teachers that aren't that hot, and what's the implications of that? And so we had a structure, is what I'm saying, for the conversation. And then that structure became the focal point of the conversation. Then the coach would first say to the teacher, well, how did you see your instruction across these dimensions? And then the coach would say, well, let me talk to you a little bit about some of the other things that I saw. The other thing we'd do is we'd bring it back to the cohort meeting. So we would say things like, you know, you're really getting better at X, Y, and Z, but we feel like there are these key behaviors that we need to be attending to. We tried to limit the feedback to no more than 3 important things to think about.
Thank you.
All right, well, thanks everyone so much for coming. Mary, thank you. This was a real treat to hear you talk about these issues. Join me in thanking Mary for being here. All right, we'll see everybody later. Thank you.
Thanks for coming to the social studies person.